Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Markish and I'm the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Gaining Consistency and Productivity Through Rapid and Iterative Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances with IAG Consulting. Keith will be presenting alongside Mitch Bishop, Chief Marketing Officer of iRise. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including a Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I would like to also say thank you to iRise for sponsoring this event. At this time, I will turn over to Mitch to get us started.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. And what I'd like to do is sort of tee up Keith with a quick talk about enterprise visualization and what that means to business analysts. Next slide, please. So, we talk to a lot of CIOs, a lot of IT leaders. We go to a lot of CIO conferences, and what we're hearing, of course, in this kind of an economy is that the number one issue facing IT organizations today is cutting cost and seeing if there's a way of shifting maintenance dollars to innovation dollars to position organizations for growth later on. And next slide. And what we're hearing is that CIOs and other IT leaders are really looking at a couple of major strategies to get there. The first is rationalizing and modernizing systems to improve efficiency and also to cut costs. Next slide. And the second thing that they're looking at is extending existing global sourcing initiatives even further. And next slide. And of course, business analysts are at the front lines of these kinds of initiatives, these kinds of projects. And yet, next slide, the way that business software is designed, developed, and delivered is fundamentally broken from our point of view. The latest Standish Group numbers actually have come out just earlier this year, show that there's actually a disturbing trend to the negative here, that 68% of all projects actually fail, and they largely fail due to bad requirements and bad communication between business and IT. The size and scope of this problem is enormous. It's in the tens of billions, if not the hundreds of billions of dollars, if you look at what is spent every year on application development. Next slide. So the way we see it, there's really two major issues going on here. The first is that business users really don't know what they want until they see and interact with it. And, of course, if you're coding up a system, if you're rationalizing SAP instances or modernizing a system from mainframe to thin client, the first time that the business users actually get to see and interact with it is when it's already been done, and that's clearly too late. The second issue, next slide, that we're faced with is that the business users really can't interpret the tools that are being used today by business analysts. We've all experienced, the stakeholder review meeting where everybody's flipping through 500 pages of specs, and the text requirements, the use cases, the screenshots just aren't conveying to the business person what's going to be built. Oftentimes they just sign off on these giant documents without really reading or understanding them, and then the business analyst is forced to turn around and then hand these artifacts downstream, and of course there's confusion about what to build from the downstream organizations as well. Next slide. So my question to business analysts is, do you really want to walk into your next stakeholder review meeting, with the old requirements document? Next slide. The impact of all of this is dramatic. With apologies to Intel, who actually had a very nice earnings announcement today, the impact is dramatic in terms of long hours and delays. And from a business analyst point of view, they get associated with projects that fail, and that's not good for anybody. There's little recognition and obviously a lot of late-stage rework, late nights, and strained relationships. Next slide. So the solution from our point of view is what other industries have done to solve this problem, and that is to visualize or simulate before you build. You can think of visualization as CAD for business software. It's a way of quickly assembling a working preview of a proposed application and actually using using it in the process of sitting down with the business analyst. And the visualization looks and acts exactly and behaves exactly as the final product. So the business stakeholders can see and interact with it early in the process. Next slide. And this fundamentally transforms the business and IT communication process. The business analyst can now bring a working visualization to a stakeholder review meeting, for instance, and you can rapidly iterate on that visualization right in the meeting. So instead of flipping through giant binders of documents, you're instead actually interacting with something that really looks and acts like the final product. The business analyst can then deliver this visualization artifact along with the other artifacts to the downstream organizations, eliminating confusion and actually giving a head start to the QA documentation and training folks. Next slide. So we often get asked, what can you visualize with iRise? And basically the answer is any application with a complex user interface. So whether that's a web application or portal or a packaged application like SAP or IBM or Oracle. We even have a template for iPhone applications that's been used on some interesting apps for the iPhone. Anything with a complex user interface is a good candidate for visualization. And any project where there isn't a user interface, maybe it's some kind of back-end integration, probably is not a good candidate for visualization. Next slide. So we've had some great success. We're over 300 customers now, many of them Fortune 1000 organizations. Over 20,000 BAs have been exposed to iRise. And what they're telling us is they get to market twice as fast. They're able to virtually eliminate rework. Organizations, IT organizations are transformed from, a pure service model to being a true partner with the business. And for the first time, business analysts are really empowered with a set of tools that put them at the forefront of getting more done. Next slide. So our vision is that, very soon here, by 2020, all business software is going to be visualized just the way that you wouldn't dream of designing a new car or an airplane, a bridge, or a building without using CAD tools or visualization and modeling tools. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our featured keynote speaker today, Keith Ellis from IAG Consulting.
Thanks, Mitch. Again, today's discussion is about gaining consistency and productivity through rapid and iterative requirements. That sounds like a mouthful. It is a lot of content, in fact, that we're going to try to pack into the next half hour, 35 minutes of discussion. And in fact, I can apologize for that right up front, that I'm going to try to pack too much in. But I know that we're recording the session, so a lot of people, if I run through a point too quickly, there's always that opportunity when you're doing discussions like this to kind of hit the rewind. But today's discussion is really about getting that consistency and productivity. It's organizations, they spend so much time sometimes trying to force-fit requirements, almost like a square peg into a round hole, and they set barriers in front of themselves. It's like, you're trying to achieve success. You know where that success is, but you set barriers in front of yourself. And so today's discussion is all about, hey, how can you remove some of those barriers? Maybe change thinking a little bit. Maybe change the way you're going to market a little bit with the way that you're doing the web, with the way that you're doing the requirements, and that begins to improve your overall approach. And that's what we're really going to talk about. So when we get into the discussion, what I want to make sure that I'm sharing with you is lots and lots of data. I know as analysts, we're always in that position. We're always stuck in that position where about 1/3 of our time is out there doing analysis, and 2/3 of our time is stuck trying to convince stakeholders to just follow great process. And that creates all kinds of challenges. So what I want you to walk away with today is lots and lots of good data that you can use to help your stakeholders get on board with good process. And I want to make sure that we're sharing that. We're going to be talking about consistency and productivity, and I'm going to reinforce that as we go through. It's okay if you're a one-analyst organization. There's a lot of things that you can do. The challenge that a lot of organizations get into is when you scale to 10, 20, 30, 300, 400, 500 analysts all the way through your organization, what happens out there? How do you maintain consistency? How do you accelerate productivity with those larger groups? And I'm not just going to talk about gaining little bits of productivity. What I want to really show you is how do you go about gaining quantum improvement in productivity. And I want to share some secrets, tips, traps, these kinds of ideas for you as we kind of go through this discussion. And I want to make sure that you're getting results that you can quantify. Requirements are kind of a funky thing. People, if you ask somebody, are requirements important? Everybody's going to say requirements are important. 95%, 97% of people will say, yeah, good requirements important on projects. But does that cause them to change? Or does that cause them to take action? Does that cause them to change behavior as a result of understanding that? And oftentimes the answer to that is no. So I want to make sure that we're talking about quantification that you can turn into results and results that you can quantify. And not just be, by the way, talking about Chicken Little. Hey, oh my gosh, all these problems. Let's talk about an actionable framework that you can use to move forward with. Now, a quick word about IAG, who we are, what we're all about. We're an organization that, in one sentence, specializes in requirements discovery and management. That's all we do in life. We have done maybe 1,200 engagements out there, worked with something like 300 of the Fortune 500 companies, and most of the time when people call us up, they don't call me up and say, hey, Keith, I got an easy one for you today. Most of the time they're calling me up and saying, hey, Keith, I've got 30 to 300 stakeholders, I've got unions involved, I've got this is much bigger than what we're normally used to. My analyst organization is very immature. We want to dramatically change what we're trying to do. So we engage with people across a broad spectrum of issues that they're having. They're having issues on a specific project. They're having issues associated with trying to dramatically improve their productivity in the organization. They're having issues in terms of dramatically changing their overall processes in here or implementing technologies such as iRise. Or they're really trying to say, hey, listen, our whole requirements area is broken. We need to have that a center of excellence put in place within this organization and dramatically change this. And we spend a lot of time, effort, and money in looking at and researching best practices out there. In fact, one of the studies that I'm going to share with you some results from and share some pre-release results from is the Business Analysis benchmark, which you can go onto our site at iag.biz and you can download all that information for free and just pick that up. So I'd encourage anybody who's looking to and wants more information and data to just head to our site and take a look. And I'm going to challenge you, is this your requirements process? Does it look something like this? You set up so many barriers because for 70% of organizations out there, this is the requirements process. We've got this problem with I'll call it an obesity pandemic in North America. And not being fat, what I'm talking about is requirements being too fat. The whole documentation structure that a lot of organizations are using is just so overwhelming, it creates all kinds of problems for organizations. It takes too long. Do you know the average organization will take, for $1 million project, the average organization will take 17.6 full-time person weeks to generate requirements for that project. That's almost 4.5 months to generate requirements on $1 million project. I mean, that's a long time. You're creating far too much effort, and so we have these complaints about, can we maintain and contain stakeholders as they're working with this? Can you maintain their interest over such a long period of time and maintain the level of commitment that you need? And of course, you're not going to be able to do that. On a $1 million opportunity like this, IAG's approach, we would probably run the business requirements phase of that in something like 5 to 10 working days. I mean, we're really talking about a radical compression in the overall amount of time. And when I'm talking about business requirements, I'm talking about process flow defined, data flow defined, business rules defined, your structured statements of system capability defined, the first part of your overall data dictionary. All these other kinds of things done and complete. So you have to start looking at removing these barriers, and the way you remove them is by looking at maturing your organization. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to ask you at the end of this discussion, and I'm going to walk through what I mean by these different layers of maturity. Okay, and then I'm going to ask you, where are you today as an organization? How mature are you? Because first of all, it gives me a very good idea of who we've got on the phone and what we're dealing with as, and it allows me to bend my presentation toward the needs of the people who are on the discussion today. The second thing is, I think it's important for everybody to know as we go forward, well, hey, what are the impacts of some of these things? And if you implement some of these strategies, what might happen? So I'm going to go through it very quickly to find these things. Okay, in terms of requirements maturity in an organization, level 1 maturity is really what I'll call ad hoc. If you had just kind of one word for it, I'd call it ad hoc. And it's that companies try to do requirements on projects. Every project will tend to be different. There will be a lot of reasons why every single project is going to be different. You might be using a lot of independent subcontractors. But basically what you're doing is you're saying, yes, we have to do requirements on projects, but you're getting a lot of variation. Now, the next one, in terms of form and structure and everything, and the way that you're going about doing, the next thing is, next level up is level 2, which is defined. And this is characterized really by individual-centric. It means you've actually gone out and you've defined what are the processes that we're going to use, what are the templates that we're going to use, how are we going to do this, who is doing this for our organization. All these things are defined. But what you're getting is kind of very individualistic performance. So some people are performing very well in your organization. Some people are performing fairly poorly in your organization. In fact, you might get highly inconsistent results. So the issues are going to be things like, you might still be getting project control issues and time budget control issues on projects. Implemented is level 3. Okay, now remember, I'm going to ask you to tell me what layer you are. So as it starts to identify, you start to identify with the layer, write it down. Implemented is when you've really spent the time, effort, energy, and budget to develop consistency in your model across your organization. So you've trained people, you've evolved your process, you're getting consistently clear, accurate, and complete requirements. Now, you may be in a position where stakeholders may not like it, but at least they're following it, okay? At least they recognize that it needs to be done. You're still not necessarily getting awesome projects all the time, but you're not getting the blowouts or failures either. When you get to institutionalize, the best way to think about this is that requirements themselves are really part of the culture of your company. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the story of GE and Six Sigma, but it's a lot like that, where if you're an executive at GE, you would never think about doing any kind of strategy-related project or change within the organization without due deference to Six Sigma and that approach to analyzing the organization, understanding defects, understanding change, and then managing those defects in terms of process change. You wouldn't even think about it. It's just so ingrained in the culture of the organization. So when you start pushing to level 4, you're at that point where people wouldn't even think about doing a technology project without following great practices in terms of their requirements. It's just so much simpler to go the route of doing projects in a great way and really running that well. And then continuously optimizing is all about that you really understand the metrics of your organization, the metrics of doing requirements well, whether it be clear, accurate, complete, whether it be the timeliness of it, whether it be stakeholder efficiency, whether it be visualization or some other thing, and you say, how do I optimize that particular layer of this thing? How do I get better and better at that thing? Because that's what's driving our requirements efficiency. So what I want to do is just have that poll launched for people and help me out. I'm going to ask you, which of these 5 are you most aligned with today? So performed is you're doing requirements on projects. You try to do requirements, but it will tend to be different all the time. Defined is you've actually gone out. You've defined your processes. You've defined your templates. You've defined what you want to do, but you're getting a lot of inconsistency in execution from person to person all the way across your organization. Implemented is you've got stability across your organization. You've actually gone out, invested heavily in rolling this thing out across your organization, and you've got consistency. That's the key word, consistency. As you go from there to institutionalized, you're really making this part of the fabric of your organization. So hopefully we've hit about 60 or 70%. Adrian?
We're about 55%, and looks like everybody's still voting. Give me 5 more seconds.
If you're in a room of 10 people or more, you just got to pick a number.
There we go.
You want to share the results? Okay, so what we've got, it looks like about half, 60, 70% of people are kind of level 1, level 2, and about, I can't see the actual numbers, looks like maybe about 30, 20% or something like that, and level 3, and et cetera, all the way down. So about 70%, I think, of people are going to be sitting in level 1 and level 2. Again, I can't really read it from here because the writing is so small, but that's okay.
Yes, 17% number 1, 51% number 2, 24% number 3, 6%
Okay.
number 4.
Fantastic. And you know what, guys? Every single time I do this, I get about the same results. So you guys as a team are pretty consistent. And so let me share with you some data. And let's bring it back. Let me share with you some data. So because this is reality for 70% of companies. And 70% of companies are what I'll call maturity level 1 or maturity level 2. And the recent study that we did, this is, again, source IAG, it's Business Analysis Benchmark. 70% of companies are level 1 or 2. And what that means is that on-time delivery is about 30%. Okay? On-budget delivery, under 40%. Delivering the functionality required, under 50% of projects. Projects deemed successful, under 50% of projects. And in fact, as you go from level 1 to 2, what becomes very frustrating for people is that you get such a small performance increase. You spend this time and effort trying to define, oh my gosh, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're doing here, and you start describing it to people, and you go from the yellow zone to the blue zone. You're not getting that quantum performance increase that you expect, and it becomes a little frustrating. A lot of people, they kind of fall off the bandwagon in that particular point. But the reality is, level 1 and level 2 companies, which is 70% of the market out there, okay, in excess. In this particular group here, it's about 75%, okay? Level 1 and level 2 companies are more likely to have a failure on their hands, are more likely not to deliver on time, not to deliver on budget, than they are to deliver on time, on budget, and be successful. You're improbably successful. It means, you know, it will happen from time to time, just not consistently for an organization. And I think that's a real shame, because in candor, you can, by maturing your organization, you can, in fact, radically change the performance. And the difference between success and failure on projects really is that quality of business requirements. And what this is showing you here on this particular slide, again, hard data, hard facts. If you're level 1 or level 2, you are producing low-quality requirements, okay? Which means you are probably paying 60% more for your applications than an organization that's optimized in doing requirements. 60%. You're taking almost 60%, about 55% longer to do your requirements or to do your projects than the organization that's optimized in doing requirements. Even if you consider yourself average, let's say for a minute you say, oh, look, you know what, we've rolled this out, we're pretty good at this. Oh, gosh, I'm a 3. Okay, you know, we're pretty mature as an organization. You know, you're 36% more. And what I challenge you today is, how many of you, when you're buying a car, are willing to pay 36% more for that car, same functionality, than you could get kind of going down the street? I'm going to say no. In fact, how many of you would be willing to pay that much more for a pizza? Okay? So I think what we have to recognize is that in the IT organization, there has been an acceptance that, yeah, things are late. They go over budget. We have issues in terms of functionality, et cetera. But as the organizations mature, as we get better and better at really defining requirements, there's going to be that increased competition and separation between who are the ones that do requirements really well. And they will outperform and out-evolve competitors who don't do requirements really well. How can you stay competitive in a market when you're paying 60% more for every piece of functionality out there? It's going to be really difficult. So let's stop and talk about what's getting in the way. You know, there's this overemphasis right now in a lot of organizations on the physical document itself. And what I mean by that is it's the obese requirements. You have to think about requirements not as a document Great requirements are a process. Great requirements are not a document. I know that's going to be a little strange, because when you think back on your last strategic project, which you're probably thinking about, if I asked you to visualize it, you would probably be thinking about a picture in your mind of a document. Some of you are saying, well, what requirements? But, you know, you're probably thinking about a document. What you need to think about is this. Great requirements come from a great process. It is very difficult to get great requirements, which is an artifact. Great requirements from a lousy process. It's just very unlikely to happen. The idea of obese requirements is people focusing on too much of the wrong information at the wrong time. And so what you need to do is start thinking about, how do I get the right information at the right time and iterate? Because by iterating, you remove that log jam. Okay, you remove the log jam that sits in the way of trying to get too much into one document, therefore the document never gets produced. It's like trying to write War and Peace and saying, you know what, gosh, get all the way through, and it just doesn't happen. The next thing is you're going to have to start thinking more and more about that stakeholder experience. You see, what is the rate-determining step out there today in terms of IT and IT development? My challenge to you is the rate-determining step isn't the ability to develop the new technology. It's the stakeholder ability to participate in defining requirements. It's the stakeholder ability to participate in IT projects. Organizations are flatter. They're dealing with more things. They've got many, many, many more changes that they're trying to drive through at the same time. Getting access to these people, keeping them focused, keeping them in discussion, and driving that as quickly and efficiently as possible has to be a point of optimization. The next thing is, great people with lousy support just doesn't work within organizations. You can go out and hire fantastic business analysts, and if you put them into an organization that's very immature at doing requirements, you know what? Fantastic employees in an organization that's very immature at doing requirements will underperform consistently in all areas. Not as good employees, not as good analysts in a very mature organization that's mature at doing requirements discovery and management. So interesting findings. Let's talk about removing those barriers. Again, I don't want to just talk about, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, we're all Chicken Little here. Let's talk about removing barriers. And I want to share with you, I don't want to call it the secrets of you know, achieving greater success, but you know, I really want to make sure that I can show you order of magnitude improvement is possible. Not only is it possible, but it's very achievable through some very specific kinds of activities that you can take on within your own organization. In fact, let's face it, if you went back 10 years, only 10 years, how mature would the practices of requirements really be? Right? We're mostly waterfall, we're mostly a whole bunch of other things. We were very immature as an industry. So take a look at the quantum improvement that's happened 10 years, 5 years, etc., and sort of carry that forward in your mind. How much faster is this whole area and discipline of requirements discovery management going to evolve into the future? It's going to really accelerate, which means organizations need to break across that chasm of level 2 to level 3 thinking. Let's talk about how, let's talk about performance improvement. And first and foremost, I do need to get in your face a little bit and show you that it's possible. And the only way I really can do that is to show you some of the results that we achieve with our own clients. And here's some examples. So what we've done is we baseline everything here. And what we found is, and the yellow zone is whatever they were using before, and the green is what they were using with IAG when they use our requirements discovery process. And what this is showing you is that organizations, and what we're doing is 36 projects across 6 clients, matching up projects of equal size. They ran one using whatever they were using. They ran one with us using our requirements discovery process. And we found that changes to requirements dropped by 75%. It's not the requirements can't change. Ours is a highly iterative process. But as you gain consistency, as you gain clarity, accuracy, completeness, as you gain consensus, requirements will tend not to change. So changes per 100 requirements drop 75%. The total time across the organization needed to drive the requirements drives 58%. How important is that to your stakeholders? You're going to spend 60% less time in meetings with analysts trying to drive requirements. That's important. And of course, because you're doing it far faster and it's changing a lot less, obviously you get significant reductions in total costs associated with driving the projects. And let me share with you some of the secrets that we have in terms of driving these kinds of real quantum performance change, because we're not talking about a little change here. We're talking about a whole lot of performance improvement that you're talking about implementing into organizations. The first thing I want you to do is challenge the requirements process. 70% of you out there are level 1, level 2 organizations. There is not a nice, clean process that you have today to really drive requirements. In fact, I'm going to bet your requirements process looks a little bit like this. Okay? It's a challenge. Some of your organizations, it's not written down. There's an expectation that if I give you a template and you take that template, then you will just naturally be able to know the right questions at the right time to be able to elicit the information from our stakeholders and just fill in the template. There's an expectation, and that expectation is just not true. You have to challenge the requirements process and say, wait a minute now, what are you really trying to do here? In fact, you know, am I as a manager or as an executive driving this analyst process, you know, am I basically am I just handing analysts something equivalent to a Ouija board and expecting them to kind of sense their way through getting this material in? It's not reasonable. To get consistency within your organization, to get repeatability within your organization, you need to start defining not only what the outcome needs to be, but how are people going to go get that information? How are people going to go across the organization and actually begin to drive this out? And what's the implicit process in things like documentation? And let me hammer this point home to you, okay? So I'm going to show you an example of a business requirements document that I downloaded off the internet. And I apologize. I just went to Google and I typed in business requirements document template, the first one that wasn't an IAG one I pulled off, okay? And let me just walk you through this. I'm going to open up a poll in a little bit. I'm going to walk you through this because I want you at the end of this discussion, the end of me walking you through this as fairly and completely as I can, to say, is this a good business requirements document? The first thing, okay, is you had to, you know, you fill in the author, and para just means paragraph, so that's the space for the person to put in the author. In this particular structure, they put in review and approval, name and date. Okay, pretty straightforward. There's a grid there. You fill it in. Scope, they left a paragraph. They didn't really put in a lot of this detail about what scope is. They just said scope is the header, and they said describe the scope of this project. Overview and objectives, and they just left a paragraph, like a little space for overview and objectives. Business justification, again, another paragraph. Put that in. Business requirements. Now, here's what they were talking about in business requirements. What you had to do is they said you can either use a spreadsheet, a flow chart, or a process model. We want you to describe basic work or business processes. If you are using textual, you need to describe basic work or business process as 4.11, 4.12, list, basically, etc. And then identify the processes to be automated, and that's, again, a list. Technical requirements, which is when I looked underneath the cover of technical requirements, they had hardware, which they just wanted you to list, and software. And under software, really my interpretation of that was that they were looking for configuration requirements. Usability requirements, again, as a list. Functional requirements, again, as a list. But what they were talking about in functional requirements was more data acquisition requirements, data analysis requirements, and data output requirements. Security, and underneath the covers there, physical and logical. Compliance requirements. Now, they did an amazing job in compliance requirements. Just phenomenal definition here. You know, because they had a whole series of subsections of compliance requirements and what you needed to do. Operate and use requirements, they're really getting into more the, when I went under the covers of this, the geographic distribution of this, the system load stats, the kind of all of the ilities, you know, all the non-functional stuff, data requirements. And in here, what they said, the only instruction, I just wanted to give it to you straight out. Again, I'm just trying to, as cleanly as I can, represent what this template was all about. Because I'm going to ask you, does this look like yours? Is this a good business requirements document? So provide detailed description of data requirements, including the data model for the computer solution. That's what it said. Test requirements. So when I looked underneath test requirements, it really looked like they're looking for a user accept requirements and the glossary of terms. So let me ask you, and Adrian, if you push the poll for me, is this a good requirements document? And just a yes or no. Again, I want to understand where people are coming from with this. Does this look like what you're doing today? How are people doing, Adrian?
I think we're good. Here are the results.
Okay. About 50-50. Okay. Again, typical. Now, if you have any questions as to why this particular structure would give you all kinds of headaches, there's a webinar we do on Inside Effective Business Requirements Documentation. But for the purposes of today, because there really are, I mean, that's the challenge with business requirements, is that sometimes on the surface, something looks fantastic. It looks spectacular. But there are very, very significant flaws with this particular structure. But one of the ones I want to talk about is pure and simple process, okay? What would it take to go and get this information that they're looking for? And all I want you to do, the only thing I want you to do, in fact, I want you to go back to your office, the 50% of you that say, yeah, this looks good. I want you to go back to your office, and all I want you to do is put the document headings on a timeline, okay? In other words, what I mean by that is take the heading and say, to get this information, what would I have to know to be able to do this all the way down through? And what you'll see is that this template could be better referred to as 13 steps to failure. Because the analysts, there's no way they're going to be able to go through all 13 steps here and then get review and sign-off and approval. So those of you who this looks like what you're doing internally today, you are probably having all kinds of problems getting a review and approval on your documentation. Why? Because there's an implicit process that lies underneath the way you're doing these documents. And that implicit process is broken. In this case here, there needs to be at least 2 or 3 documents that you're dealing with instead of trying to fold it all into one, first and foremost. Because what you're trying to do is, what happens to that analyst as they go through this process? Are they going to do perfect information, high, complete, accurate, complete, clear, accurate, complete information all the way through? There's no way. Because what happens when they get to the end and something that happened at step 3 is in disagreement, they're going to then have to go back to step 3 and do it again. So either you've got 13 iterations through this document, 13 iterations. How is that reasonable possible? Or there's going to be a very lightweight, incomplete, trying to push as much information as we know into each of these pieces. Not going to happen again. So when you stop and look at it, you say, what's effective in terms of a process? What's effective? It has to have clarity, accuracy, and completeness. So if you've got something that's set up like this, yes, it may be from a risk management perspective, you need all of that information. But your structure for going and getting that information is flawed. Therefore, you're busy shooting yourself in the foot. You want it, yes, that's good, but it's the right information at the right point in time. The second thing is, is it useful? Is it serving the intended needs of a particular audience? Let me ask you, can a business stakeholder sign off on this? Absolutely no. It's so many technical requirements and technical in-the-weeds kinds of issues in here. How can they sign off on this? Can a technologist sign off on this? No, because there's so much business-related content here. So who exactly is signing off on this content? It's going to be very difficult, and it is inefficient for the business analyst who's trying to drive through this process. And the answer to that is clearly no. They'd have to iterate 13 times. It's just not reasonable or likely that they're going to be doing this well. So the second secret that I want to share with you today is make sure you have all the pieces to run efficiently within your analyst organization. Now, I'm not talking about pieces in your documentation, because we've just proven that the wrong piece at the wrong time creates all kinds of problems. But what I'm talking about is to do requirements well, you need to have a lot of pieces within your organization around process, around technique, around staff, around governance, etc., that all need to fit together. It's like, let's say you're FedEx, and you've got, stuff you need to package and carry in shipments, but you don't have the infrastructure to go get these shipments, to go manage the organization, to define what skills the pilots need, to go automate the essential elements of the process, all these sorts of things you don't have. How likely is it that the planes are going to end up where you want them to go? It's pretty unlikely. It's like a clock. If you're missing a lot of gears, there's just all kinds of dead weight. So let's talk about what those pieces are, because if you're going to progress in your level 1 or level 2 organization, you want to go from level 1, level 2 to level 3, 4, 5, you need to start thinking in terms of not just what overall level of maturity you are, but where are you in things like process? Where are you in things like staff competency? So process is, what are people expected to do? Staff competency are their skills, their roles, the definition of all that, what services, etc. The tools that they're using. In other words, what technologies. Are you trying to use WordVisio, or are you very advanced using something like iRise? The practices and techniques that are out there. So in other words, not what people are doing, but how people are doing it. Is that defined for anybody? The organization, so what services are being offered? How is that managed? How are the overall resource, what's the resourcing of this whole thing? And then the deliverables and results. So the requirements deliverables are only one component of this whole thing. One component. And people, when they try to re-engineer their analyst organization, they get too focused on that one component, and they ignore the other elements around it that are required. And so as a result, they've got very mature, potentially very mature templates that are rolled out across. They may be level 3 in terms of the requirements deliverables. But because they're level 1 in every other area, guess what? The organization defaults down to the lowest common denominator, which is level 1. Then they get very frustrated. It really makes all kinds of problems for the organization. And then one of the things that we do with a lot of organizations, we actually assess organizations' maturity against this model to help them build out that roadmap. Where are you weaker? Where are you stronger? Where are the roadmap elements? And that's something that you can do in maybe 5 days or so. It's not a huge effort, but as a result of undertaking these kinds of effort, you start building out your roadmap, saying, where can I best target to make very significant improvement in my organization? The last thing I want to talk about is catalyzing your benefits. You see, people intuitively understand that requirements are important. All of you intuitively understand requirements are important. But the reality is that 70% of organizations on their last strategic project, what I mean by strategic project is on average $3 million project, okay? They're not small. Did requirements in such a poor fashion that they drove up their costs by 30 to 60%. Huge. The people who were worst at it were twice as likely to fail than they were to succeed. And you start seeing things like the chaos report saying we're getting worse at this. Why? Because our businesses are getting so much more complicated. We're getting less time available to do requirements, and requirements are so important. So people intuitively understand that requirements are important, but will they take action? Invariably, the answer is they don't. It's like losing weight. Everybody understands what it takes to lose weight. Of course, we have this obesity pandemic. People know you lose weight by eat less, exercise more. It's that simple. But do we take effective action when we do that? The answer is typically no. And one of the things that you need to do is begin catalyzing benefits. What I mean by that is express benefits in such a way that your organization sees those benefits and starts taking action. And it's hard to gel that within organization. So here's what I want you to do is, what happens when you improve maturity? As you go from level 1 to level 2, organizations today, you're probably doing something like 50% of projects on time and on budget, 50% or so, okay? What happens with a lot of low-level maturity organizations is that functionality gets pushed out into, phase 2, 3, 4. So even though, you're on budget, theoretically, what ends up happening is you're pushing so much functionality out that it just ends up cascading costs. So what I want you to do is I want you to pick. Do you prefer to have projects on time? What's most important? On time, on budget, delivering on function, or the projects are really successful for your organization? Pick A, B, C, D. Which one is most important to you? Okay, now that you've mentally gone through and picked that, the neat thing about maturing your requirements discovery and management, okay, using the model we talked about there, is that you get all of them. Every single one of those factors is critical. Every single one of those factors drives up significantly as you start going from level 2 to level 3, level 3 to level 4. You get all of them. The point I'm making today is when you catalyze your benefit, you start picking which ones of these are most important to my stakeholders. Let's start focusing in. Let's start talking about that. Let's start optimizing it. And let's see if we can drive above the curve. So let's talk about actions that get results. And I'm going to share one more example, and then we're going to go to our Q&A. So actions that get results are things like, how do I get on the path? How do I start this process? How do I start moving forward? And a lot of people, they do what's called a pilot with us, and they say, okay, look, we just want to run a project with you like this and see how this works and compare this against other projects. And that works very well. You can baseline your maturity, and that begins to set out that roadmap for you and your organization. The other thing you can do is start defining your services. In other words, if you're an analyst organization, don't assume that your stakeholders understand what an analyst organization does and what it should do. You can say our analyst organization has certain services. We have the service of helping people scope projects, helping people to facilitate requirements discovery sessions, helping people to do whatever, okay? Those are your services. Define them and start looking at your capabilities behind these in organizations. And I'm going to give you one example of a pilot, okay, and a compare, just so people start to understand. And this is Michigan Department of Transport. Now, their baseline is this was a $1 million project, and they just said, listen, we want to try, understand what happens when you start improving your requirements discovery management. What happens within organizations? And so they gave us a $1 million project. Now, this was really, according to them, based on their history and overrun, this would end up at a $1.4 to $1.6 million project in reality. So they said, yes, we think this is a $1 million project, and they're really good at doing the assessment on this. Now, what we were able to do is, first and foremost, compress requirements discovery into a 2-week timetable. Now, that doesn't mean 10 full days with stakeholders. What it talks about is you're actually probably doing the full discovery within about 6 or 7 days. 6 or 7 days of stakeholder time, and you're there. You've got process flow, data flow, business rules, structured statement of system capability, and you've got a good beginning on the data dictionary. At least the conceptual data model is all put together for this thing. The next thing is, when this went out, because it's an outsourced development, the responses coming back on the RFP that we prepared for these guys came back plus or minus $30,000. Plus or minus $30,000 on a $1 million opportunity. Obviously, the vendors are understanding what is needed here clearly, accurately, completely. And the vendor that won, and they're not listed here, basically said, we will deliver on time, on budget, on function, or we will take on financial penalties in this particular case. And the net result to this organization was the project didn't cost $1 million, it cost under $1 million. Cost under $700,000, in fact. And they reduced their ongoing maintenance costs by 30 or 40%, something like that. So what has to be said to people is, what would you prefer? To spend that 1.4, which is what they likely would have spent, or spend 700 or so, and actually get it on time, on budget, on function, and reduce ongoing life cycle costs. So this is my last slide before we wrap up, and I'm hoping this has been a valuable session for people today. Requirements are a process. They're not a deliverable. I want you to visualize for yourself requirements in your last strategic project. Visualize that for yourself. Because the picture in your mind should not be a document. The picture in your mind should be of the process that got you to that document. A lousy process will yield a lousy document. A great process will yield, guess what? Great requirements. Okay? So you've got to think about not only what are you trying to achieve from an artifact perspective, but what are you trying to do from a process perspective that delivers that. Never underestimate the complexity. A lot of people have tried to make change and tried to make improvement within their organization. I hope I've shown you that there's a lot of different pieces in here, a lot of moving parts. And you need to optimize a number of these different parts, but there are some very good techniques that can be used to achieve very solid success, like baselining your organization, like these other kinds of things that I've been talking about today, really simplifying the deliverables, start looking at what you need to do, what information at what points in time are optimized, and all of a sudden you'll find your flow rate of projects increases by about 50 to 60%. Now all of a sudden stakeholders are much more interested and they're much more engaged. Remember, I say this is insanity versus critical mass. Insanity is, the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay? So let's say you introduce a new template out into the organization, and you've done this before, but you're going to take the exact same people with exactly the same skills and exactly the same processes and exactly the same stakeholder relations, etc., and you're going to say, do it again. And how are you expecting to get a different result just because they're filling in a different sheet? It doesn't work.
You need to think in terms of critical mass. Do I have a critical mass of net new capability? Do I have enough people with enough capability at this point in time to achieve a different result on these projects? And as a result of that, am I expecting to get a different result rather than, hey, I've resourced this thing the same, basically I'm doing the same thing, and I fall into the same pitfalls I fell into before. They're radically different concepts. You need to start thinking about how you dramatically change, showcase the change, use that change to galvanize interest and focus within your organization. Don't just describe the benefits, catalyze the benefits. Catalyze means describe your benefits in a way that causes people to take action. And that takes a lot of work. It takes really understanding what's valuable to your stakeholders and expressing it in a way what's in it for them. People understand what it takes to lose weight, but they tend not to do that right up until you tell them that they're going to die in a couple of years. So what you need to do is start thinking about, how do I express this in a way that allows me to make sure people are taking action as a result and doing it in a different way. And the last thing I'm going to say is, get out of the way of your own success. There's a lot of things that we do in analyst organizations, or a lot of things analyst organizations do, that are set up for the best of intentions. They are very, very well-intentioned things. And by the way, my hat is off to anybody who can make significant change happen within very complex organizations. But those changes that they make end up creating all kinds of downstream problems for the organization. And they're basically getting in the way of their own success. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. And I'm going to turn it over onto the last slide to Mitch to surface the questions both of iRise and of IAG. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. That was part business process modeling and best practices, and part motivational speech. So that was great. Hey, a lot of questions have come in directed at you, Keith, and IAG, so we'll get right to them. And I will let everybody know that if we don't get to your question today, we will certainly get back to you on email. So one question that came up early on, Keith, was, has IAG seen any difference in when you assess requirements processes and poor requirements in particular? Is there any difference between SDLC methodologies like waterfall versus agile?
Actually, there are differences, and it all is based on the maturity of the organization. If you go to, and it's not released yet, but there's some data that came out in the Business Analysis benchmark just recently. What we found is that there is no difference between agile and waterfall and iterative or any of these other kinds of base methods. What ends up happening is that there are differences in people's maturity level in the execution of that methodology. So what I'm going to say is, first and foremost, make sure you're using the right kinds of methods at the right time. So very visual-centric systems, hey, there's different ways of going about doing that. Very small systems, there's different ways of going and doing that. But you need to have mature processes first and foremost. That is what increases that's what improves your organization more than any other variable that you could consider.
So at the end of the day, rapid iterative methodologies, they can work or they cannot work. It really just depends on the maturity of the process.
What you have to do is, first and foremost, begin dramatically stabilizing it, and then you start saying, well, how do I best optimize this for this particular organization? And we find that rapid and iterative tends to be the best starting point, the best starting point for making significant change. So it's easier to kind of evolve from that to some other thing.
Got it.
And mature it.
Somebody asked a question here. Does IAG have a book on their business requirements process? I mean, there's a lot of useful information here. Have you guys written a book about it?
Well, you can certainly go to the Business Analysis benchmark, which is a study, and you can kind of review some of that. We have just a ton of webinars and other activities that you can participate on the IAG site, so there's maybe 10 or 12 different webinars that are out there. We're continuously running education sessions with organizations, and certainly if you're really looking to understand a whole lot more about our methods and practices, then you're best to bring us down on site and to begin engaging and transferring the knowledge.
Very good consulting answer. Love it. Hey, here's a question about iRise, which I'll take. Somebody's asking a question about the role that visualization can play in the design of a UI. And typically most organizations have user acceptance testing, of course, at the end of the process, because obviously they need to be putting the finished system in front of users. And so this is, very backwards, of course, because any meaningful feedback that you gather from user acceptance testing becomes a very expensive proposition in some cases to change. And one of the real benefits of visualization actually is moving to a user-centered design approach where you're moving user acceptance testing actually to the front of the process before any coding happens. And the business analyst can work in collaboration with the UI designers and the usability professionals to create a high-fidelity visualization as part of the requirements process. Not only do you get the right requirements from the business, but you're able to rapidly test and iterate on the design of a high-fidelity visualization right with your customers or the end users of that application. So by the time you actually deliver a visualization artifact to downstream organizations, you know for a fact it's going to get adopted. You know that user acceptance testing is going to be a breeze, and you're really taking a lot of risk out of the project from an adoption point of view. So hopefully that answered that question. One viewer here has a question for you, Keith. The business analysis benchmark that you discussed, how similar were the projects and the companies? Were they from the same industry? Was there a minimum budget or a minimum project staff?
Yeah, there was. First of all, it was across all industries. It was a global study, but really centered in on North American organizations were the preponderance of the participants. We wanted to make sure that we were getting people who understood requirements processes into the organization. And as you saw, the number of respondents was extremely, extremely large. So 437 or something like that was the number of respondents that we're looking at. So very, very large sample sizes that we were dealing with. So yes, there were some criteria in there. I think it was you had to have completed at least 4 projects in excess of $250,000 because we wanted to make sure that people had enough experience with enough complexity of projects that that it was reasonable. Now, the second thing we found is that a fair number of very large companies participated. So the results are probably skewed a little bit more towards larger organizations rather than, very teensy-tiny organizations. But you're going to get similar results anyway, regardless of the size of the company. Certainly in our digging through the data, that's what we're finding.
Got it. And I think, do we have time for one more question, Adrian?
Yes.
Okay, one final question. Again, we'll get to all the rest later. When you mentioned 5 to 10 days to gather requirements, how do you get your users to digest the requirements in that time frame? And there's a second part to the question. For international users, not all stakeholders are always present. So people are taking requirements back to the stakeholders to get decisions. How do you get a group consensus in that 5 to 10 day time frame?
Yep. Okay. So great question. Every single time you're doing requirements, you do need to, we're creating a requirements discovery plan where we're optimizing, because what you're doing when you're dealing with broadly distributed organizations, widely distributed requirements group is going to be a little different than what you're doing with the vast majority of circumstances where you can actually bring the stakeholders together. So in the circumstance I was talking about there, we're dealing with 1 site and 2 sites, 3 sites where we're actually able to bring the stakeholders together for a condensed 5-day period where we're able to run and actually drive sessions. The issue that people get into is how efficient are those sessions? And if you make each of those discussions, every single hour of those discussions, highly efficient, then people will continue to come back. If you make, the first hour, the second hour, the third hour, all of a sudden the first day is, people are saying, hey, gosh, you know what, that wasn't as useful as spending of my time. I wasn't making decisions that were really critical to my business. Then what ends up happening is that person, the next day sends their designate. Then the next day after that, the designate says, oh, gosh, you know what, we're not really, spending a whole lot of time here that's really valuable. The next day, that person sends their designate's designate. And by the end of the week, nobody's at the sessions. But if you're really efficient and you're focusing in on asking the right people at the right time, the right kinds of questions, you're actually able to even keep SVP level people in the room for a sufficient period of time to drive very, very, very high quality and thorough, clear, accurate, and complete requirements. So in that particular case, now as you scale that and you start changing it to an international dynamic, there are other things that we do using technology, sometimes not, sometimes using multi-site techniques, sometimes not, that allow us to deal with very, very distributed environments. There was one we did which we had 7 different country executives coming in from across Europe, and we had to do a global supply chain integration system. You've got exactly the same issues there, only you're dealing with multiple languages, and in that one we were extremely successful.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Keith.
I would just add that from an iRISE perspective, our product supports global stakeholder review either through online meetings or shared server access to visualizations, and our shared server collects comments in a nice way together for the business analysts. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adrian for closing comments.
Great. Thank you again to all the participants for attending this Modern Analyst webinar. And many thanks to Keith and Mitch for a very informative presentation. I wanted to quickly point out that the webinar along with the slides will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days, so they'll be available there for you for your reference. This concludes today's event. Thank you again, and we hope you have a great day.